Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a topic that was actually a listener request.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's about the Opium Wars and their impact on China.
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah, and honestly, when I first saw this request, I thought, oh, this is going to be rough. You know,
Yeah, I get it.
like one of those history lessons.
Right.
But as I started digging in, I realized how wrong I was.
Really?
Yeah. Turns out you can't really understand how China operates on the world stage today without looking back at this period.
That's so true. It's like the echoes of the past are still shaping China's worldview.
Yeah, exactly. And get this, one of the things that set off this whole chain of events was Britain's huge demand for tea.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Right. Who knew that a simple cuppa could lead to international conflict and change the course of history?
It's fascinating how seemingly small things can have such huge ripple effects.
I know, right? So to really understand the significance of the Opium Wars, we got to go back in time a bit.
Okay.
Back to the Qing Dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty.
Okay. The Qing Dynasty. A dynasty full of contrasts. Early on, there was this period of prosperity and stability.
Kind of like China today, right? The economic boom and all that.
Yeah, you could say that. But just like modern China has its challenges, the Qing dynasty eventually faced its own problems too.
Like what?
Well, you had corruption within the government, economic struggles, and even simmering rebellions.
Whoa, so the seeds of unrest were already there.
Exactly. And this internal weakness made them vulnerable to external pressures, particularly from, well,
From a certain island nation with a taste for tea.
precisely. By the 1800s, Britain was deeply in love with Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, you name it.
Yeah, those were hot commodities back then.
They were. But the problem was, China wasn't really interested in anything Britain had to offer in return.
Uh-oh. Trade imbalance alert.
Exactly. And that created a big problem for the British.
So what do they do? Force everyone to drink English breakfast tea?
Haha, not quite. They found a different, much more problematic solution, you could say.
Oh, I'm sensing this isn't going to end well.
Yeah, it's not a pretty story. They flooded China with opium.
Opium, like the drug.
Yeah, from British India. It was their way of balancing the trade deficit, but it had devastating consequences.
Wow. And isn't it ironic that now, centuries later, China is often accused of unfair trade practices by other countries?
It is quite a twist of fate, isn't it? But back then, the Chinese government saw the opium problem for what it was.
Right, a disaster.
Absolutely. It was destroying lives and undermining their society. So they tried to crack down on the trade.
Makes sense.
One key figure in this effort was Lin Zexu. He was an official who took a bold, almost defiant stand.
Oh, I want to hear this. Tell me more about him.
Well, Lin Zexu orchestrated a massive seizure of opium in Canton.
Wait, seriously?
Yep. Imagine warehouses piled high with chests of opium, all confiscated and destroyed.
Wow, that's a power move.
It was a direct challenge to British power and a pretty pivotal moment that ultimately led to war.
The Opium War.
The first Opium War, to be precise. It began in 1839.
So, did Lin Zexu's plan work? Did it stop the British?
Sadly, no. The British, with their advanced navy, basically dominated the war.
It's a bit like bringing a knife to a gunfight, isn't it?
A perfect analogy. The technological gap between the two sides was immense. The Chinese were fighting with outdated ships and weapons against a modern, industrialized military force.
And I bet the consequences were pretty severe, huh?
They were. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, forced China to make major concessions.
Oh, no.
They had to cede Hong Kong to the British, open up several ports for trade, and pay a massive indemnity.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt. Both literally and figuratively.
It did. The Opium Wars were a turning point in China's history. They marked the beginning of what's often called the Century of Humiliation, a period where China felt deeply exploited and weakened by foreign powers.
Century of Humiliation. That's a pretty heavy phrase. I can see why this period would have a lasting impact on China's psyche.
Absolutely. And to think this was just the first of the Opium Wars.
There's more. What happened next?
Well, even though the first Opium War was over, things were far from settled.
Right, there was that whole Century of Humiliation thing looming.
Exactly. Resentment was simmering, tensions were high, and the trade disputes that started the whole mess hadn't really gone away.
So round two was inevitable.
Pretty much. And this time, the spark that ignited the Second Opium War came from a seemingly minor incident.
Really? What happened?
It involved a ship, a Chinese vessel called the Arrow.
The Arrow. Okay.
Yeah, so British forces boarded the Arrow, claiming it was involved in piracy,
Oh, boy.
but the Chinese government saw it as a violation of their sovereignty.
Oh, I can see how that would escalate things.
It certainly did. This Arrow incident, as it came to be known, was a huge symbol of the power imbalance between China and the West.
A reminder of the humiliation they'd faced just a few years earlier.
Exactly. And as if things weren't bad enough, Britain found an ally in this conflict,
Ooh.
France. They teamed up, putting even more pressure on China.
So basically, China was outnumbered and outgunned.
Pretty much. And the Second Opium War, like the first, ended with a series of treaties that further chipped away at China's sovereignty.
More unfair treaties.
Yeah, this time it was the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860.
What did those treaties do?
Well, they expanded foreign privileges in China, like allowing foreign envoys to be stationed in Beijing.
Oh, so even more foreign influence, right, in their capital city.
Yeah, and get this, they also legalized the opium trade.
Wait, what? They were forced to legalize the very substance that had caused so much damage.
I know, it's crazy, right?
That's just adding insult to injury.
It really was. It shows how these opium wars weren't just about opium itself. They were about control. Control of trade, control of territory, control of China's destiny.
And I imagine these defeats, these forced concessions, really had a ripple effect within China, too.
Oh, absolutely. The opium wars didn't just weaken China on the world stage, they also fueled internal unrest.
Like what kind of unrest?
Well, for one, they contributed to the Taiping Rebellion.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that
Which-
was a devastating civil war.
It was. Millions of people died.
So you have this external pressure from foreign powers,
Yeah,
and then internal chaos and instability as well. A recipe for disaster.
exactly. And it's a reminder that a nation's internal stability is often closely linked to its position in the world.
Right. When a country is seen as weak, it's more likely to be exploited.
Exactly. And for China, the Opium Wars were a brutal wake-up call. They realized they needed to change if they wanted to survive.
So this is where the idea of modernizing China really starts to take hold.
Exactly. Out of the ashes of defeat, they began to look for ways to strengthen themselves and reclaim their power.
Fascinating. So tell me, how did they go about doing that? So we've been talking about how China started modernizing after the Opium Wars, but I want to go back to that phrase you used,
Which one?
the Century of Humiliation.
Right.
It just sounds so, like, powerful and kind of ominous, you know?
It is. For China, that phrase isn't just a chapter in a history book, it's a living memory,
Oh,
a reminder of national trauma that shapes their thinking even today.
it's almost like a wound that hasn't quite healed.
Exactly. And just like any wound, it can be easily reopened.
So how does this idea of the Century of Humiliation influence how China acts in the world today?
Well, for one thing, it's used to justify their assertive foreign policy, their military buildup, and their desire to be a global superpower.
So it's like they're constantly trying to prove they're not the sick man of Asia anymore.
That's one way to put it.
But doesn't that make it harder for them to cooperate with other countries?
It can. It creates a kind of us versus them mentality, a sense that China always has to be on guard.
Right, like any perceived slight is a threat to their national pride.
Exactly. It makes diplomacy much more complicated.
So it sounds like the Opium Wars, even though they happened centuries ago, are still having a huge impact on China today.
Absolutely. They cast a long shadow over China's relationship with the world.
It's crazy how events from so long ago can still be so relevant, so powerful.
It is. But that's the nature of history, isn't it? It shapes who we are, even if we don't realize it.
I guess that's what makes studying history so fascinating and also a little bit scary.
Yeah, sometimes it can be both.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those early trade disputes to the Century of Humiliation and China's rise as a modern power.
It's been quite a journey.
I have to admit, I started this deep dive with a lot of questions, and now I feel like I have even more.
That's a good thing. It means you're thinking critically, engaging with the material.
True. And I think that's a great place to wrap up our discussion today. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Opium Wars and their lasting impact on China. It's a complex and fascinating story, and one that's still unfolding today. We hope you learned something new and maybe even got inspired to do some more exploring on your own. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.